School did not just fail to make you a better learner. In measurable, documented, scientifically studied ways, it actively made you worse at it. Not by accident, and not because the teachers were bad people. The damage came from the structure itself. A system that, from the very first day you walked through the door, was built to work against the way human brains actually learn. Here is what the research shows, what history's greatest self-taught minds actually did instead, and the specific techniques that replace what school destroyed. Because once you understand the mechanism, you can reverse it. Before formal schooling existed, every human being who ever mastered anything, a language, a craft, a science, an art, did it through self-directed learning. The institutional model where a certified instructor delivers standardized content to groups of same-aged students, following a fixed syllabus, on a predetermined schedule, that is historically brand new. It became the dominant model in Western societies only in the 19th century. For the entire stretch of human history before that, all meaningful knowledge was transmitted through apprenticeship, observation, independent reading, and mentorship. What we would today call autodidacticism, from the Greek words for self and teaching. The question is not whether self-directed learning works. The question is what formal schooling does to the natural learning ability you were born with. And the answer from decades of research is not comfortable. The foundational work comes from two psychologists named Edward Desai and Richard Ryan, who spent decades building what they called self-determination theory. Their research identified three specific psychological needs that have to be met for human beings to learn genuinely, deeply, and with lasting retention. The first is autonomy, the sense that you are choosing what you do. The second is competence, the experience of actually mastering challenges. The third is relatedness, feeling connected to people who genuinely care about your development. When all three of those needs are met, human beings learn with remarkable speed, creativity, and depth. When any of those needs is frustrated, let alone when all three are systematically blocked, learning becomes effortful, resentful, and shallow. Formal schooling frustrates all three, almost from the first day, and it does so by design. Think about what a child does before they enter school. A toddler who has never had a lesson in their life learns one of the most complex cognitive tasks in human existence, acquiring language, entirely through intrinsically motivated trial and error. No one forces a toddler to learn to speak. The child attempts it because the feedback loop itself is rewarding. Because trying something, failing, adjusting, and getting closer to the goal is inherently satisfying to the human brain. That is the default state of human learning, driven from the inside, sustained by natural curiosity, and reinforced by real-world feedback. Formal schooling transfers control of what to learn, when to learn it, how to learn it, and how quickly to move on entirely to an external authority. The teacher, the curriculum, the exam schedule. And it does so the moment a child walks through the door. Desai's research on what he called the over-justification effect shows exactly what this external control does to motivation. In carefully controlled studies, Desai demonstrated that introducing external rewards, grades, performance-contingent praise, competitive rankings, for activities that people had previously engaged in voluntarily caused a measurable, statistically significant decline in intrinsic motivation. People who had genuinely enjoyed an activity began to see it as something they did for the reward. And when the reward was removed or reduced, their engagement dropped below even its original level, below where it started before the reward was ever introduced. Schools apply extrinsic motivators to virtually every dimension of learning, from the moment children enter, for the entire duration of their formal education, typically 12 or more years. The cumulative effect is a progressive erosion of the intrinsic motivation that makes deep learning possible. Beyond motivation, formal schooling interferes with a specific cognitive capacity that the brain uses to direct its own learning: curiosity. Curiosity, in the neuroscience literature, is associated with dopaminergic reward circuits. The brain treats a genuine unanswered question as a pleasurable itch that motivates investigation. Psychologist George Lowenstein's influential information gap theory explains why this mechanism is so powerful. Curiosity fires when a person becomes aware of a gap between what they know and what they want to know. That gap creates an almost irresistible drive to close it, which directs the brain's learning energy precisely toward the information it needs most, at the exact moment it's most motivated to receive it. Formal schooling largely ignores this mechanism. The curriculum decides what you will study and when, with no reference to whether you have developed any genuine curiosity about it. The result is that students spend years acquiring and trying to retain information for which they have no motivating curiosity, while simultaneously being redirected away from the specific questions that their natural information gap drive would lead them to pursue. Over time, many students learn to suppress curiosity entirely, because following it gets you off topic in class or behind in the syllabus. The habit of asking, "What do I genuinely want to understand?" which is the engine of every real intellectual breakthrough, gets slowly replaced by the habit of asking, "What do I need to know to pass this test?" Then there is the problem of how schools train you to process information, and this is where the structural damage becomes clearest. Research on memory retention consistently shows that active recall, actually attempting to retrieve information from memory, rather than passively rereading or listening, is one of the most powerful drivers of long-term retention. The testing effect, sometimes called retrieval practice, has been replicated across hundreds of independent studies. Students who test themselves on material they are learning retain far more of it, for far longer than students who spend the same time rereading their notes or reviewing a textbook. Yet the dominant mode of instruction in most formal schooling is passive reception. The teacher explains, the student listens, the student rereads their notes before the exam. The exam itself is used primarily as a tool of evaluation, not as a tool of learning. And once the exam is over, the material is rarely revisited. There is also a technique called spaced repetition, reviewing material at increasing intervals calibrated to the brain's natural forgetting curve. That has extraordinarily strong empirical support going back to Hermann Ebbinghaus's foundational memory research in the 1880s. The research consistently shows that information forgotten in predictable, mathematically describable patterns can be converted into long-term memory with a fraction of the study time required by cramming, if reviewed at precisely the right intervals. Formal schooling almost never implements spaced repetition. Material is taught in a unit, tested at the end of the unit, and then largely abandoned. The following academic year, students cannot recall most of what they studied 12 months earlier, not because they are forgetful or lazy, but because nothing in the system was ever designed to support long-term retention. Now look at what the history of extraordinary intellectual achievement actually reveals about how deep learning happens outside of institutions. Abraham Lincoln had fewer than 12 months of formal schooling in his entire life. He taught himself law by borrowing a copy of Blackstone's Commentaries and reading it obsessively by firelight. Alone, without a teacher, without a curriculum, without a deadline, driven entirely by his own curiosity and ambition. He taught himself Euclidean geometry as a middle-aged man, because he believed working through logical proofs would sharpen his reasoning, not because anyone assigned it to him. He memorized enormous quantities of Shakespeare and biblical text, not for any exam, but because the material genuinely fascinated him. Lincoln is widely regarded as the greatest autodidact in American political history. Michael Faraday, one of the most important scientists of the 19th century, and the person who discovered electromagnetic induction, the principle underlying every electric generator on Earth, had virtually no formal education. He worked his way from bookbinder's apprentice to scientific revolutionizer through voracious self-directed reading and obsessive experimentation, guided by nothing but his own curiosity about how the physical world worked. Srinivasa Ramanujan had no formal training in advanced mathematics. Working largely in isolation in India, he independently rediscovered and surpassed results that had taken European mathematicians generations to develop. He filled notebooks with original theorems that the mathematical world is still exploring more than a century after his death. Benjamin Franklin was formally schooled for approximately 2 years. He educated himself through voracious reading and a specific self-improvement technique. He would read an essay, set it aside, try to reconstruct it entirely from memory, compare his version to the original, identify where his understanding had failed, and repair those gaps. That technique, attempting to reproduce what you have read rather than simply rereading it, is one of the most effective active recall strategies documented in modern learning science. Franklin discovered it on his own in the 18th century, simply by paying attention to what actually worked. So what does actually work? The research literature on learning science, combined with what history's most effective self-educators actually did, converges on a consistent set of specific principles. The first is curiosity-led inquiry. Start with questions you are genuinely motivated to answer, not questions assigned by an external authority. Genuine curiosity, the emotional state of wanting to close a specific knowledge gap, dramatically improves how well information is encoded and retained. The second is active retrieval practice. Test yourself on what you are learning constantly from the earliest stages. Never passively reread, when you could instead close the material and attempt to recall it. The discomfort of failing to retrieve something is not a sign that the method isn't working. It is the mechanism through which your brain builds stronger memory traces. The third is spaced repetition. Return to material at increasing intervals, structured around when you are on the edge of forgetting rather than when it feels comfortable or convenient to review. Software tools that implement spaced repetition algorithms can automate this entirely once you load your material into them. The fourth is the Feynman technique, named after the physicist Richard Feynman, who was legendary for his ability to explain complex ideas in simple language. The technique is this: attempt to explain what you are learning as if you are teaching it to someone who has no background in the subject whatsoever. Wherever your explanation breaks down, becomes vague, or relies on terms you cannot define clearly, that is where your understanding has a gap. Go back to the source material and close that gap, then try the explanation again. The fifth is interleaving, studying multiple related topics in alternating fashion rather than exhausting one topic completely before moving to the next. Research consistently shows that interleaving produces better long-term retention and more flexible application of knowledge than blocked practice, even though blocked practice feels more productive in the moment. The sixth is project-based application. Use knowledge in real problems rather than abstract drills. The problem-solving demands of an actual project, building something, writing something, creating something that has to work in the real world. Create exactly the information gap curiosity that drives deep learning at its most natural and most effective. The single most important shift that all of this points to is the same shift that separated Lincoln, Faraday, Ramanujan, Franklin, and every other great self-educated mind from the average student sitting in a classroom. They took control of what they were trying to learn, and why, and how, and their brains responded exactly the way human brains were designed to respond to that kind of ownership. If you want to go deeper on the specific tools and systems that make self-directed learning sustainable, not just in theory, but in daily practice, that is what the next video on this channel covers. The framework there is built on exactly the same research covered here, and it is the natural next step.